Having a small issue. Be careful.
Well, hello and welcome to today's webinar, which is on managing legacy voice recording transition. My name is Adrian Sharp. I'm a contributing editor covering RegTech Insight for A-Team Group, and I will be your moderator today. Before we begin, I've got a few items to alert you to, upcoming events, which you'll see the details at the bottom of your screen. So we've got a few webinars coming up, hearing from the experts, AI governance best practices on September the 9th, best approaches for trade and transaction reporting on September 11th, managing non-financial misconduct under SMCR coming up in October 9th. And finally, we've got two big RegTech summits coming up. Those are our biggest RegTech events of the year. October 16th in London and November 20th in New York. So be on the lookout for those. Today's webinar is being sponsored by WordWatch and will be conducted under the Chatham House rule, which simply states participants are free to use the information received today, but neither the identity nor the affiliation of any of the speakers nor that of any other participant should be revealed. So please respect the rule. I'll ask the speakers to introduce themselves shortly, but first, for the audience, just to let you know how you can participate today. At the top right of your screen, you'll see a Slido panel with tabs for polls and questions. We'll be running 3 polls today, so please add your votes. Make this as interactive as we can. That helps the panel and provides context for everybody else. And also, we'll be taking questions. We'll actually open up the questions for the panel probably about halfway through, but the Q&A panel is open all the time. So as you're hearing, as you're listening, if thoughts come to mind, post a question, and we'll see what we can do to get to it. So I'm going to ask the panelists to introduce themselves in a sec, but first, we're going to start with an audience poll. So put up our first poll just to try to level set and see where people are in their legacy voice recording transition. So your options are no project plan yet, risk assessment business case phase, vendor selection POC phase, migration in progress, or project completed, migration completed and the old system decommissioned. So those are your opportunities. So what I'll do now, while the audience is voting, is ask the panelists to introduce themselves. I'm going to start with Jason.
Yes. Hello, everyone. My name is Jason Shu. I'm a compliance manager at Vanguard and work in the market surveillance and monitoring team. I have over 8 years of experience as a practitioner in all things surveillance and have been at Vanguard for over 3 years now. And I'm based in the London office.
Very good. Next up, Simon.
Good afternoon. My name is Simon Matthews. I'm from Knight Consultancy Practice, a specialist company dealing with technology and business alignment, and a focus on working with that. I have been working with that organization for 8 years and a 30-year career experience in financial markets.
Great stuff. And Chris.
Hi there, my name is Chris Reed. I am the head of product for WordWatch, based in London. I've been looking after WordWatch for about 3 years now. WordWatch is a single pane of glass for all of your regulatory interactions. So that's me.
Great stuff. So let's see if we have any votes just yet, but we'll start off with our first panel question, and then we'll come back and look to see what the votes have been. So first question for our panel. So how have recent SEC record-keeping settlements and the EU's MiFID II retention rules reshaped the minimum standard for voice recording governance across global desks? And Jason, I'm going to start with you from a practitioner's point of view.
Yeah, so I mean, over the last few years, definitely the SEC and CFTC, so the US in general, has thrown a bit of a spanner in the works with the over $2 billion in fines on off-channel communications. We've seen that in the WhatsApp space, the iMessage Signal space, and effectively anything that maybe moved into a personal device usage setting. We've seen that from the US side, and then contrast that a bit with the MiFID II side. From the EU perspective, the mandate has always been to record all telephone conversations and e-communications that is intended to be resulting in a transaction, even if it doesn't actually land into a transaction side of things. We have almost like a separate point of view between the two sides. However, there is some alignment when it comes to that mandate to record. I would say that historically we've seen more stringent form of regulation, let's say from the EU perspective. However, the SEC and CFTC have definitely thrown something out there to say, actually, our rules aren't necessarily that much more lax in that perspective. And I think from a global operations perspective, I think the questions for the firms themselves is actually what standard you actually follow and stick to. Do you pick effectively the highest bar and then you have a consistency across the piece, or should we stick to our own jurisdictions and keep to a particular standard based on where you're located? So that's something definitely interesting, and how that's reshaped that minimum standard across the globe.
Interesting. Simon, some thoughts from you on this one?
Yeah, I mean, we've seen a lot of fines, particularly around kind of data management, and particularly, whether it's e-com data as well as audio-com data. And actually, so it's the whole piece in itself is part of that. I think we've seen, since the popularity of Teams has become more and more, that the voice recording is not just the audio, it's the text, it's the other communication services. And as Jason was saying, the cross-channel or off-channel services that people are now utilizing. We've seen it a lot with WhatsApp, but at the same time, we're seeing demand in terms of from buy-side organizations wanting to use tools like that, interacting in sell-side. So the number of modalities in play is more, and that makes it more complicated in terms of how do you keep a track in terms of all of those communications. And as in the question itself, in terms of the global desk, no longer are you looking at your whether you're meeting compliance to each individual territory of where you're operating, where you've got teams that are multi-geographically spread. You've got the interaction between them and the information that they're passing as well. So as a parent bank organization, you'll be taking a risk and a liability view in terms of looking at all of that. And then yet again, as Jason was saying, the change in the regulation kind of, it's evolving, and that really has changed a lot more in the last few years than we've ever seen before. I think coming out of COVID, we saw, we had to have temporary rules during COVID, and since then, things have opened up quite a bit.
Yeah, interesting. I'll tell you what, let's, Jerry Ann, let's bring up the poll results and see where our clients are. Chris, some thoughts from you on how you're seeing the recent sort of record-keeping settlements from your experience. What are you seeing out there?
Absolutely. I'll probably follow on from Simon a bit there. As we moved out of the COVID times, the expansion of the coverage that we have to have, and this isn't just storage anymore. This is the reconstruction of the trade interactions. It's having to have policies, testing and monitoring in place. So there is quite the emphasis on us now, rather than just capturing and storing these calls. I also think there's the clarity around video conferencing is an interesting tidbit to call out here. I think for a long time there's been conversations about should we not, do we need to capture video conferencing, and I think it's understood and quite clear now that absolutely that is something we should do, especially clarified by ESMA on that. So yeah, some interesting tidbits on there, just adding on to what the guys have already said.
Great. So just looking at the poll results, getting a sense for where our audience is, it looks like there's quite a few people in in the business case phase, almost a half, and then some are already going ahead. There's a few going ahead, and there's a few that are really no project planned yet. So, maybe they maybe they don't have a lot of voice communication. I tell you what, let's move on to this next question, because I think it's picks up on the first piece and sort of perhaps drills down into the weeds a little more. So what are some of the biggest compliance challenges that a multinational firm has to navigate across the jurisdictions? So we got FINRA Rule 3170 taping, CFTC subsections 131, 135 record keeping, ESMA MiFID II Article 16. I mean, very prescriptive, whole set of different instructions. So, what does that mean for the compliance department? And Simon, I'll start with you.
Well, I think one of the things to probably say about compliance, Dan, I think Jason will probably kind of correct me if I'm wrong with this, but compliance are there to assist the business. It's not about a policing of anything like that, which is kind of an old world view. Compliance is there to ensure that the business is meeting its obligation and enabling to go to market with new products, new services as quickly as possible and achieving that. The change in the communications does have an impact in terms of the tools that you allow to be utilized. And how you are actually monitoring those. So market abuse regulation particularly has really changed an awful lot in the terms of the way that we do. And that's moved to a more automated approach of surveillance. So rather than the manual processes we used to have in our monitoring activities in compliance, we're now moving to a space where we're looking to be more automated and utilizing that data. And that reconstruction of communication, we experience it in our personal lives, whether we have a conversation with someone, we can't remember, but did I start that conversation on WhatsApp? Did I start it on a Teams message? And we're seeing this in the professional engagement as well, whether they're utilizing something like Bloomberg Chat, or they're moving to LSEG, or moving into, yet again, back to Teams, back to a voice call, back to a trading device. So that does change a lot more. With the regulation, though, specifically, I think the bigger challenge is the interpretation. MiFID was quite clear in terms of electronic communication. However, the subsets of note that ESMA have published, for avoidance of doubt and not limiting to, have said that video conference calls is considered electronic communication. Now, not everyone today is yet capturing video. I think at some point, a lot of this is people waiting for a test case to kick in, and then everyone will switch on video recording. But yet again, if you do that, comes back to what can you do with that data when you've got it. It's not just about ticking a box to say, yes, we've got that, risk is just managed. We're actually looking at how you can do something intelligent with that. And I think that comes back to that question, as you phrased it, which was managing that risk.
Yeah. Jason, some thoughts from the practitioner side?
Yeah, I agree with effectively what Simon just summarized there. But I think if I was to take a slightly more zoomed out approach initially, so when we think about the MiFID rules themselves, the mandate around that includes that pre-trade intent, and that interpretation aspect then comes in terms of some gray areas to, okay, at what point is that conversation required of recording versus, let's say, the US rules, which is more emphasis on the post-trade documentation side of things. Now, in terms of the operational compliance challenges themselves, in terms of the landscape of the surveillance operation, so from my point of view, how do we coordinate in the most efficient way possible for that surveillance aspect? So balancing through the e-coms, the voice communications, that matches the risk appetite for the firm itself. So I think the question is, how does your firm operate in instances where there may be separate surveillance teams amongst different jurisdictions, and how do you match that in terms of what sort of level of standard do we go on? And then separately to that, with the development of AI, artificial intelligence, those two lines sort of get drawn in closer and closer together. So then how do we make it more efficient in that way where we can utilize that technology a lot better? So that's one aspect. The other aspect I think is we should be mindful for is actually the data privacy element as well. So given the mandate from MiFID II, you can see that trade-related conversations must be recorded. However, when we stand on a tightrope when we think about that in comparison with the GDPR rules, for instance, where there is, let's say, call it a data minimization from those particular rule sets themselves. And then maybe the third element as well is about the tech fragmentation. So although all the different regulators expect a similar format of reproduction of that particular data set, there are expectations of different formats in the specification themselves. So it's something to bear in mind when we think about the bigger challenges, that there are multiple challenges. Is as to which one you want to put on top, that is up for debate.
Right, good. Okay, let's sort of switch tacks a little bit here. So looking at enforcement actions and the actual cost, the actual impact to a firm when things don't, when things don't go right, where do firms incur the greatest financial pain when they delay retiring an unsupported legacy recorder? Chris, I'll give you, this is yours to start with.
This is mine to start. Thank you very much. So, yeah, I think I'll probably touch on DORA a little bit on this one. DORA states that you basically have a responsibility to manage and govern your infrastructure, your appliances. So when we get to the point where we have call recorders, where you have capture systems that are no longer supported, suddenly a whole list of requirements land on you, and frameworks to kind of register these risks and manage them. Honestly, you've got to consider, is it worth going through this rigmarole and managing these registers and managing these processes? Or should you look at the best way to centralize your data? Bring your data into a single place where you can use it, and we'll talk later probably about how you can use your data upstream, but centralizing your data to reduce your risk, and making the lives of your compliance team, Jason, much easier, right? If you have a number of legacy systems all out of support that people are having to trawl through, that's not fun. It raises risk of missing things. People have different usernames on different systems. And kind of a semi-joke, but there's sod's law here, right? Is the time that you'll need a system is the time that for one reason or another it won't be available to you. So yeah, you're just adding layers of risk, and it's those layers of risk that will feed those mismanagement of records and those fines that come with it.
Right, stuff. Excellent. Simon, some thoughts from you on the impacts of enforcement actions and where people are really feeling the pain.
I mean, so I'll pull together two elements here. So assurance of data is critical, and assurance means knowing that the records that I have are actually the records that I have, and that I can identify the people or users and teams accordingly. The older the system, the less the accuracy is going to be of that, and particularly if you've had recordings that you've had to hold for legal hold, maybe it's been the LIBOR or Euribor that you've had to hold for a longer period, which most of now has just been released. But coming out of that, people are holding records for nearly 20 years. 20 years ago, the record detailed the metadata you kept of the individual, who they were, they are linked into a HR database, and all, much less. The longer you hold those records for, the more complicated it is to recreate it. The newer systems that have been implemented now can be more accurate in identifying which, first of all, that you've got the recordings that you need, whether it's an electronic communication or an audio communication, and you can minimize it down. To Jason's point, you want to keep the communications that are needed, not the ones that aren't. And you want to be smart in how you're optimizing that. Holding information that you don't need to hold is a risk and a liability in its own right as well. So you really should be looking at this from the data itself is the thing of integrity. Legacy systems have an inherent danger, and with that then does the assurance of the data that's there. So for me, you kind of come back to it from a business angle and go, well, I've got to keep the record. Am I holding the records I am supposed to be holding? And what am I holding that I shouldn't be?
Okay, some good insights there. That brings us actually to our next audience poll. And that's going to ask, how confident are you that you can produce an untampered voice recording within the regulator's time frame today? Highly confident, moderately, limited confident, or really not confident at all. So while the audience is considering those things, we'll move on to the next somewhat related question, which is, what risk assessment checklists should tech and compliance teams complete before they unplug a legacy platform to ensure zero data loss and full audit continuity? And Jason, this one comes to you first.
Yeah, so I sort of bucket these into maybe 4 areas. So data preservation being one of them. So when we're thinking about moving across platforms from the legacy to a new platform, firstly, I'd want a full inventory of record types to be stored. That includes structured and unstructured data. So we understand actually what were the limitations in the old system and actually what are the limitations in the newer system, if there are any, to that matter. So you rather get that right in the first place. Simply what we mentioned before, actually the regulatory retention requirements periods. Does the team know? Do the teams know what the requirements are when they're implementing that particular system in place? And then actually the storage types for considerations, can it be played back and reproduced from a user interface perspective and quickly and timely for that matter? Now, the second element would be the data migration side of things, so the reconciliation point. So this may be more of a task for the tech teams or the IT teams to consider. So that testing of migration of cores, making sure that there's 100% of data reconciliation side of things through validation testing and whatnot. And then the third element, this brings it to a more surveillance angle, and that is from a surveillance user perspective, can I access it? And do we know how to use the platform? Simply as what is the scheduled training for the new users moving on to a new platform? And then if we think about the timelines as well, what are the timelines of the cutoff from legacy to the new platform? And will there be parallel runs? I think these things, they need to be called out, because sometimes if we just assume, we may fall into a bit of a pitfall of, oh no, we never got told anything. So call these out. I guess that's number one as well. And then the final piece is actually the governance and documentation of that stuff. Do we have the appropriate sign-off from the relevant departments, such as compliance, surveillance, IT security, legal, and even audit to some extent? Now, all that I just called out right there is, let's say, the perfect world scenario. And sometimes in the real world, you get pulled in the last minute to say we're going to be implementing something of that nature. And in those cases, my suggestion or recommendation is actually whoever said whatever is assumed, make sure that is in writing. So at least you have a starting base point or a foundation to work with. I think when everything is said in words, he said, she said, and next thing you know, someone said, but then there's no one actually owning what was said. So that's my few takeaways on that end.
Yeah, spot on. Chris, your thoughts here?
Yeah, thank you. I split it down to 4. I'll probably replicate a couple of things that Jason has said, but we perform an awful lot of migration projects. So I'll kind of take this from a slightly more technical kind of tilt, I guess. Again, first one for us, data inventory and validation. And I think pretty much replicating what Jason was saying, but I think a really important point in that is not just understanding what you have, it's understanding what you should have, but you don't have. Especially for very old systems, you get to the world of self-reporting, categorizing, and moving on from that. So it's really important that you have a very, very, very good handle of actually what you have and what you don't have. I think then we get into the chain of custody, the authenticity, assurance on that. So I think it's about, for me, there's a simple answer to this. It's identifying and choosing a solution that means that you don't have to modify your data. Not doing something's usually a lot easier than having to do a whole load of work, right? So how do you find a solution that allows you to migrate your media without having to modify it? And ensure that if someone's doing that migration for you, you really, really understand what they're doing in detail. I think there's a lot of, in our industry, there's a number of options to describe a solution at quite a high level, but you really, really need to understand exactly what's being done. Is the data being modified? Is it being transcoded? What's being done with it? Then the validation, going back to, as Jason said, so the migration validation, so just cross-checking your record counts and, as stated previously, doing your QA. Also, make sure you keep a backup for a while. There's no point going through and doing all of these checks if you've got no way to go back. So you need to agree and document the period that those backups are going to be kept for. And finally, adding on to the sign-off piece is that documentation. These are regularly complex projects. in 2 years' time or a year's time, it's not going to be clear who's done what and what for what purposes. So that technical documentation in detail about the process you followed, why you followed it, and the things and the actions taken is absolutely critical to this. And that's kind of how you really create an environment where today's calls aren't a problem for the future, is by bringing this into a single location and just keeping them there evergreen, as it were. So yeah, that's my run through of that.
Great stuff. So actually, let's pull up our audience poll, see where people feel in terms of their confidence in their current capability. So, you know, here we are, 50% moderately confident, quite a large number with limited. So, and a smaller group who feel they've got it all together. I mean, any surprises here, Jason, Simon?
I would say that if I was answering the question myself, I'd probably be in the same bucket as moderately confident. I think there is a thing of, at least from me, I've heard in the past where the regulators said, if it is green, they're most likely going to point at, okay, this is spick and span and this is perfect. So if they find any flaws, then you've actually shot yourself in the foot in a weird way. So I would say, yeah, this is about what I would see as well.
Okay, interesting. We've actually got an audience question as well, which I'm going to try and jump in here so that we stay ahead. This is actually looks to be a little technical. So, how do we guarantee bit perfect extraction from an unsupported recorder without breaking the SEC 17A4 immutability rule, good Lord, or triggering re-encoding that destroys chain of custody integrity? Chris, you touched on this a little earlier.
Absolutely. So there's a number of technical methods we can use to demonstrate and document that media is exactly to the bit the same from one location to the next. There's an additional layer in this, is if you stop running around transcoding things, you do make your life extremely difficult to prove that nothing's changed. Beyond actually going through and listening to calls and making sure they're still valid and making sure they're still replayable, etc., which is extremely difficult. So by taking 2 steps, finding a way where you can, firstly, migrate your calls without having to transcode them. And secondly, when you do move them, taking one of these hash approaches, something like that, where you can ensure that to the bit level, those calls are exactly the same. You have all the pieces that you need to demonstrate that nothing has changed. And then you're bulletproof.
Great stuff. But this is, and again, I think this next question is kind of like in this space as well in terms of traceability. So how has metadata management evolved, and what tools are available today that enable firms to preserve, reconstruct, or reconstruct call level metadata? So timestamps, agent IDs, counterparty ID, etc. And how has the user experience improved? I guess the question there should be, if at all. And Chris, let's stay with you on this one.
Okay, yeah, no problem. It's quite kind of a relatively short one for me, this one. So, you know, as with any industry, we're in a world where we must manage and control masses of data. Okay, and interaction metadata, obviously, for us is that key one. Going back to a point I made earlier, centralizing your data into an evergreen platform, what that will do is mean that you're not having to move your metadata from one database to another, to another, to another. It's during that flow that you create the highest risk for corruption of your data, loss of data, et cetera, et cetera. So by having a strategy where you take your metadata from one place and then put it in its, probably shouldn't say final resting place, but you get my drift, into its final place forevermore, you basically go hands off, and you reduce the need for interacting with that data in a potentially destructive way.
Right. Simon, so how are you seeing metadata management evolving? And you know, some additional thoughts on this particular topic.
So, you know, traditionally we you know, in the old world, it used to be record a desk and you'd have a desk identity. We are more and more not just providing the ability for user identity, but also providing an enrichment to that. So you've got potentially the counterparties. You've got maybe a stamp of an execution. You can link it into your trade platform. You might even link it into location data as well. And all of those become really important, particularly when you're sat there as a compliance officer and you're either trying to look for something or to try to find links between things. The more points of metadata provide a much better way of actually seeing how that conversation or that communication interacted with the other things. Where were they when they had this interaction? What had just happened when we're doing communication reconstruction or trade reconstruction? As we move more and more to a cloud world and all of our communication modalities are coming from the cloud, whether it be Teams, whether it be our Bloomberg chat, our market telephony, our kind of the trader voice, or the kind of the typical PSTN mobile communication, ICE, FX Connect, LSEG, all of that's cloud based. We're joining up more and more together, and because of the cloud ecosystem, it does become easier to pull the different points of metadata. And as Chris was saying, you can write that together at one point with the original file and leave that as enriched as possible. You're not tampering with the record, but you're providing as many reference points as possible as to what that record is about, and as much context as you possibly can.
Right, good stuff. In fact, we kind of moved into this, we touched on cloud, and Jason mentioned AI earlier on. So, what advantages in cloud native capture, speech to text analytics, AI-driven surveillance are materially lowering the total cost of ownership while improving compliance oversight? So, Simon, I'll sort of continue the thought here.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of obviously a logical progression that you can see that we can get economies of scale. It's also skill sets in terms of, different financial organizations are at different size, and you need to have, smaller organizations don't have the same quantity of specialist resources as a big institution, but they need to be able to compete in that space. So having tool sets which are cloud based, having more managed service driven solutions from those suppliers becomes critical. In terms of the choice of marketplace, when your data is in the cloud and you have it secured in the cloud, you can go to the market to try more on-demand solutions of different types of speech to text, different solutions from different providers. In terms of the surveillance solutions that are available, there are more options available today than there were 10 years ago, than there were 15 years ago. And it's an area we're seeing lots of new companies start up in terms of what they can do with your data. And it allows you to kind of go, okay, let's have a look at utilizing this company for a sample piece. It gives you the chance to kind of really kind of try before you buy or commit to a particular piece of strategy than you've ever done before. And that is all about actually how you can enhance that further. Those new demands that are coming down from the regulators in terms of doing with, keeping exactly what you need to keep, focusing on exactly what you actually should have. I think this is where you have a lot you can lean into the cloud. I think traditional on-prem models have been that bigger, harder challenge. And as Chris was saying, evergreen is critical now. People are fed up of big IT projects every 5-10 years dealing with legacy systems. People want to be going, I'm paying a subscription. I know it's always going to be up to date. I know that it is evolving as I am evolving. My business is secure. And I can be sensible in forecasting what it's going to cost for me to continue to operate.
Yeah, great. Jason, your thoughts? You mentioned AI earlier.
So I mean, 4 words: reduction of false positives. That comes to mind straight away for me. I think the next big thing, and it has been for a while, is artificial intelligence and that innovation in that particular space. I think the speech to text analytics itself, that's a massive game changer. Historically, that's always been the case. However, we've seen in history that the limitation has always been the accuracy side of things. But now, as that is kind of going away as an issue itself, the explainability side of things, again, was an issue and now is becoming less of an issue as well. As we move into this space, this idea of this black box not being able to explain what it is, now we're getting more and more transparent to say, actually, we do know what is happening for the most part in these systems. And then we see that in the regulator side. So I'm not picking on anybody, but like the FCA, for instance, you can see their very transparent in the last 18 months in terms of their AI tech sprints, and even their publication from yesterday in relation to their 5-year strategy plan. It's all about innovation, and they're really exposing themselves into the space of AI. So we can see that adoption even from the regulator side to say, we know that this is a game changer, and we're also looking at this as a game changer in our eyes as well. So no longer are we seeing firms that are outliers using the AI tools and analytics in that way. We're actually seeing it's a snowball effect. Actually, a lot of firms are getting engaged. And as we get more and more engaged with it, the AI system and the innovations in that space actually improve exponentially as well.
Right. Good stuff. Yeah, I'm very pro. Well, I say pro. I'm sitting here in the United States, but looking across the sort of regulatory, the different environments, the FCA do seem to be leading the charge in terms of innovation. All the regulators say, please come talk to us. Let's have a dialogue. Bring us your questions, bring us your concerns, and that all seems like a good idea until somebody else says, well, hang on a minute. If we go talk to them, we're going to expose ourselves, and then they're going to come and look under the drains and see, find all sorts of bad stuff. So I think, like the tech sprint where you've got a couple hundred people in the room and one regulator, there's strength in numbers, and people can get up and stand and say, well, I think this and I think that, and not feel that, that they're exposing themselves to a potential visit. Unpleasant visit. Anyway, some really good stuff there. So moving on, which arguments resonate most with senior business, legal, and cyber security stakeholders to secure budget and executive sponsorship for migration that is often perceived as just IT plumbing? Chris,
Yes.
yours.
I think to start with, I'll dip back to DORA. Okay. Those measures and that governance that needs to be put in place on legacy systems is costly, distracting, quite frankly, annoying but necessary. So there's that first piece, but I think really when you're looking to gain support for projects, it's the value argument. So you have to be able to describe what value you can bring. So the data that we have, it describes the day-to-day of a business's transactions. Okay. And there's, I'll not try and cover all the different things you can do with that data here. I'm sure maybe Simon can jump in and do a piece on that. But really, by being able to gather your data into one place, be able to then make that data available to whatever system upstream that you want to use. And going back to the point that Simon made about try before you buy, try the latest system with the data that you have. By making arguments around flexibility, value add through the use of your data. And bear in mind, as we were talking about AI earlier, is that kind of day-to-day, that massive volume of day-to-day data, which previously would not have really been easily usable without millions of people working on it. That's stuff that we can use today. So by talking about value, by talking about combining your data, understanding what's happening in your business on a day-to-day basis, and then feeding that into a value proposition is probably for me the best way to support that, those funding requests for a new project.
Interesting. Jason, from your perspective, what are the things that actually I would say force, but at least encourage, senior leadership who can be sort of more than a couple steps removed from the day-to-day operation? What are the things that you see that resonate best in that environment?
Yeah, at least in my experience, to be frank, what are we trying to tackle as the firm, and what are we trying to do? Let's say if we're trying to get the buy-in or the purse, you have to think about the perspective of compliance itself. We're a support cost center. Compliance budgets are tight, and unless there's a regulatory reason why something should happen, unless they're critical, nothing will happen, right? That's fundamentally how I've always seen it, and how the response has been. Now, so the two questions that are probably the most obvious is, are we in regulatory breach? And will we be in regulatory breach should we not upgrade something? That's usually the big tickets to say if you want to push something across the line. Fundamentally, it comes down to cost. Can we demonstrate that onboarding a particular migration into a platform will actually save the business money over time? compare that either to the headcounts that we're employing to utilize the current legacy platform, to things that, future, there may be some more business products that we're launching, and hence we need a new system to cater for that side of things. And then the second aspect actually is about the cybersecurity side. If you want buy-in from the cybersecurity side, things are always being updated from a software and firmware perspective. One thing that does come to mind is actually, when we're thinking about that, legacy systems are always at risk of being cyber attacked. For instance, we've known in recent times actually where we've had vendors that's had subsidiaries being cyber attacked, and that's been circulated around. That doesn't bring confidence to a firm, for instance. So that is another thing that you can leverage when you're having those conversations with a particular cybersecurity stakeholder, for instance, because they will usually be in the forefront of, what is our chances of getting attacked, or do we have enough capability to actually stop that attack happening?
Okay, good stuff. Good stuff. Okay, it's time for another audience poll now. This is our third and final poll. So this asks, what is the principal obstacle preventing you from decommissioning legacy recorders? Your options here are proprietary file formats, so data challenges, budget constraints, fear of operational disruption, a lack of clear business ownership, or uncertainty over regulatory expectations. So whilst your audience is voting, we'll come to our next question. And this is I know one that Chris has as a favorite. How do you design a recording estate roadmap that avoids another disruptive migration cycle when regulatory horizons or communications channels inevitably expand? Simon, we'll start with you.
Okay. So I think, look, I mean, laying this out from the beginning, you've got to take a forward view in terms of the way in which things have changed and the way in things will change. So let's start with the communication channels to start with. 15 years ago, we would have said the number one mobile communication channel we would need would be BlackBerry. Today, most people in the room would go, who is that? It's gone from major dominance from just to nothing. We've seen it from COVID, Zoom being a massive solution which was never existed before. We're seeing different modalities change, and we expect that to continue to change more and more in the future in terms of the way in which our sales and our traders will interact with each other, and the supply chain of communication. If you're a sell side organization, you're dealing with buy side. The buy side, you can look at who their customers are and the communication tools that they're using, and so on and so forth. That's why you're seeing a demand for things like WhatsApp. It's because people further down that chain of the buying chain, that's the tool they'll use. That's what's easy for them to use, and people want to stay in similar formats. So you need to approach in flexibility to be able to onboard and offboard those different types of communication channels. So you need to think of the capture process in terms of modality of communication. You need to think about the data points that you can bring into that. The archiving, this is where cloud really leans in terms of being able to hold things into different sovereign territories where you will maybe obliged to hold the data for certain people into certain geographical areas, and then yet again downstream into the ability to ensure that you have a solution that is going to enable you to plug into different types of solutions for replay and surveillance. To the point that Jason was saying, we need to add value out of this, and the value comes not just in necessarily in hitting the compliance box. There is communication data there. Can I look at the way we're interacting with our customers? Is there something I can do better? Can we be smarter at the way we position products? Can I do value analysis out of that, which will enable another area of the business to benefit from that rich source of data that we've created? So I think when you're looking at that, you've got to think about those things. When you start about thinking at the holistic level, understand the business demand model and the inevitable technical changes, then you can start to build yourself a strategy which will avoid the pitfalls of what is constantly big disruptive change. Because you've got to start with that agile approach. And I think agility and cloud kind of two link together.
Yeah, interesting. Some good insights there. So Chris, I know this was one that you have a particular focus on.
Absolutely, yeah. So, from my point of view, none of us know what the future brings, and as Simon just eloquently spoke about, is there's going to be new methods. There's going to be new capture platforms that we require. There's going to be new entrants to the market in very specific niches that can answer very specific problems for us. And our best defense against that approach is having a layer, an agnostic layer between your capture layer and between your upstream systems that can normalize your data sets, so that at any point you can choose which systems that you want to use and which best benefit your business, and then feed that data without having to modify, without these horrible big legacy projects, either to capture new stuff or to feed data to new systems. By having this layer in between, you can normalize this so that at the flip of a switch, nearly, you can pass that data and do A/B testing between new champion challengers. You can feed new models, test new models. And so really, in summary, and I'll not bang on too much, but in summary, really what we're talking about is creating a layer, an agnostic layer without those vendor handcuffs. We know where that leads. So that in the future, you can normalize your data set and you can use these systems that will most benefit you, will keep you most regulated in the simplest way, without having an ever-expanding team to cover all of these different modalities. And frankly, it makes your data governance a lot easier as well. It's all in one place. It's one set of data. It's just a lot more, it's a lot simpler to live with. So just think about that middle, let's say, orchestration layer. Has to be evergreen.
Yeah, good stuff. Okay, let's take a look and see what our poll results say about where people feel so fear of operational disruption. That's good. Okay. Budget comes in next, uncertainty over regs, and proprietary file formats. So interesting, the data piece is just quite a while down. So this is really, people are feeling that this is more of an operational challenge as opposed to a sort of a technical challenge. Any reactions on this? I mean, Jason, does this surprise you?
No, I would say, yeah, fear of operational disruption is probably the main. You don't want a headache when you're doing any transitions. I think that is probably forefront of mind for anybody thinking about decommissioning and moving across. So yeah.
Yeah. Okay, we've got a couple more audience questions here, and I think we've probably touched on some of this stuff previously, but let's have a look, see here. Here's one. So once we've moved 15 plus years of voice data into a cloud archive, how do we future-proof for new channels, Teams, Zoom, mobile, and avoid another disruptive migration? So we kind of touched on that on the previous question. And then when retention rules or codec standards change. So we haven't actually talked about codec standards, but Chris, any thoughts, any additional thoughts on this?
Absolutely. I touched on earlier. You need to find a solution that means that you don't have to modify your data. Okay. So we talk about legacy codecs. We've talked a couple of times about transcoding, but really the simplest and the easiest thing to do is not to have to do that. And you know, plug in WordWatch. What WordWatch does is it runs that on the fly. So we can manage that transcoding on the fly without you needing to have to modify that data. So really, if you're in a situation where you have a legacy codec, legacy set of records, and you maybe need to move them off a legacy storage platform, it's simply a lift and shift project. So again, going back to that single layer that I was talking about, if that single layer means that you don't have to modify any of your calls, your life just becomes an awful lot more simple than if you're hacking and cutting at your calls and modifying them and transcribing them over time. So yeah, you know, we don't know what the next Zoom is going to be, but what we do know is there's ways to handle them without having to modify them. So we can be quite confident in a single pane of glass going forward.
Right. And Simon, any additional thoughts from yourself?
I think, you know, we move to a point now that we see that records our records, irrelevant to whether a voice record or whether an e-com, an electronic email or chat and so on. So, more and more we kind of see that. And I think it's, when we talk about how we have assurance around that model, it's, we have to look at the fact that those records, we have to look at holistically, and we have to make sure that we approach this for all of the communication activity. I think that's the big difference. I think up until historically we kind of went, well, we've got a secure way of doing all of our e-com or email archiving here. We secured this to DoD standard. It's meeting all of these things here. Now we're moving into voice, the challenge from there. And I think there's also a difference as well, is that when there's two different things. It is getting the data and then the proof of the data. A lot of the times when you're dealing with the regulator and they want to run an investigation, you need to give them the data so that they can listen to it or they can read it and check it. And then there's a different point in terms of proving that the original data hasn't been tampered with. They're two different things. By and large, the quickest thing they want to do is to check to see what had happened. If there's any certain uncertainty about the origin, they'll raise that. But, they want to check the communication first.
Excellent. Good stuff. Well, we're actually less than 5 minutes to go. And usually I like to wrap up with sort of people's final thoughts. So Jason, I'll start with you. Any takeaways from today's discussion that you think people should have top of mind?
Yeah, I mean, when we think about this topic of legacy voice recording and the transition, I think historically we've come to this point because historically a lot of firms have just onboarded and then forget and get on with the business, the money making side of things. You just think it's just, you pay your subscription and then that bit is kind of out the way. And what we're realizing is actually, if you look further down the road and if you foreshadow what's happening, it's not that case. Things are actually moving at a rapid pace. The regulatory mandate is very onerous. There's a lot of communications that we have to process, store, and that all costs money, frankly. So I think when it comes to new technological developments, I think the old world of operation, that needs a rethink and an evaluation by a firm, for instance, over whether their legacy approach employed is working appropriately. And it may be the case that it is, but then that evaluation needs to happen in the first place. To get to that stage. And then the other item of consideration is actually, you have to think about this piece as not a single department job or a single function job. It's a multi-function or multi-department liaison, relationship building, let's call it, between the different teams, the in-scope captured employees, the compliance, and of course, if you're using external vendors, the vendors as well. I think missing any one of those gaps, you're missing any one of those communication channels, you're actually potentially opening yourself up to gaps as well. So I think the old adage goes, rubbish in, rubbish out. Just make sure that the initial in is not rubbish.
Excellent. Simon, some parting thoughts from you.
Yeah, I think kind of building on what Jason said, I think you've got to look at governance and you've got to look at succession planning. The data now, some of us are in the latter part of our career. We're not going to be here in 20 years, but the data may well be, and it will be up to the next person who will still have to work with that data. So you've got to think of succession planning. The data that you're keeping maybe have to be alive for longer. We've already had cases where data's been kept for 20 years, possibly longer. And therefore you've got to think about the governance structure in terms of why do we do this program? What's the governance structure we've got around the operate model, and how are we going to pass that on to a future set of people, custodians of the data accordingly. As Jason said, you've got a really strong point about ensuring that you have that governance process, but you really need to ensure that you're thinking about it in enough detail that the next person that comes along can pick up, look at it, go, okay, I understand why we're doing this. There's a process, there's a methodology here, which kind of relies back to the point, why do we enrich the data with as much metadata as we can? We don't know what we're going to need in the future, so let's do the best we can now and be good custodians of the data today with a strong governance. Great.
And Chris, final thought for you.
Thanks. Yeah, I feel that we're at a crossroads really, with the ever increasing demands from the regulators, and I'm pretty sure our budgets aren't keeping track with those additional demands either. I think we can really make two choices. I think we can sit back and choose to do nothing. And what I'd bet is that in a few years, with a couple more rounds of additional regulations, a couple more systems going end of life, a couple more systems that we have to capture. We'll probably be spending most of our time fighting to keep control of our data, fighting just to be able to provide the information that we need. I think the other route that we can take is we can look to build to the future. We can look to onboard an evergreen platform that's flexible enough to handle these challenges that are coming down the road. It's going to be in the cloud, let's be honest, and it can't really lock you into a single vendor. And it will always, because as Simon said earlier, it will work with you, it will keep track with you, it will keep you compliant. And that enables you then, it gives you that freedom, as I spoke about earlier, to use the tools that your business want to use and not limiting your business. And it'll allow you to feed the tools that are emerging to make you more efficient so that your budgets can keep up with the new demands that are there. So I really think we've got a very simple choice to make going forward.
Excellent. Well, on that note, nothing really remains for me to do but to thank our sponsor, WordWatch, today, and our experts, Chris, Simon, and Jason. Thank you. It was a really good, really interactive session. Thanks to our audience for your involvement, participation, joining in. Great questions. A few reminders about our upcoming events, the big RegTech events coming up in London and November, and also we have the upcoming webinars. And last but not least, you'll see a feedback form on your screen. Please complete the feedback form, send it in, let us know what you felt, let us know what you thought was good and not so good. We need your feedback, and that helps us improve our webinars in the future. So once again, thank you all very much indeed. Great session, take care, and goodbye for now.